This week, President Yoon is set to announce his pension reform plan among other key tasks. The gist: lessening the burden on younger people and raising contributions for older generations. North Korea has unveiled its testing of so-called suicide drones, which raises the possibility of some military cooperation with Russia. Israel and Hezbollah exchanged heavy fire over the weekend as fears grew over an escalation of war in the Middle East. It's August 26, 6 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Min. We begin with the pension reform plan that President Yoon is set to announce later this week as he addresses the nation with regard to his reform initiatives of 5 key sectors. Our top office correspondent Woo Soo-young explains.
President Yoon will push for a new plan to reform the public pension scheme as South Korea's rapidly aging society faces the possible depletion of pension funds within just 30 years. According to various presidential officials over the weekend, Yoon will address the nation this week to explain the status of his 5 key reforms to improve the national pension, healthcare system, education, labour conditions and the birth rate. In his briefing, Yoon will mainly set the tone for the government's soon-to-be-announced roadmap for pension reform, the first since 2007. One official told Arirang News that Yoon feels he must personally address the issue, recognising that the national pension affects every citizen, particularly the younger and future generations.
The current structure allows people to receive more than they've paid over the years, causing a deficit. This puts a burden on future generations who have to cover the difference. When the pension system was first introduced, it was designed generously to encourage people to join. It was expected the premium rates would gradually increase and the income replacement rate would decrease over time. However, after the 1997 Asian financial crisis and even during the 2007 pension reform, there were proposals to increase the premium, but they weren't implemented.
South Korea having the world's lowest birth rate and a declining population means fewer young adults will have to support the disproportionately large number of pensioners. As experts predict, the current pension funds will run out by 2055. Those born after 1990 would not receive any payouts upon retiring at age 65, despite their decades-long contributions. Previous discussions in Parliament have focused on parametric measures, such as adjusting the insurance premium rate, how much you pay, and how much of your income can be replaced by your pension payout, the so-called income replacement rate. To secure fiscal sustainability and generational equity, the government is likely to increase the premium rate from the current 9% to 13%, which the ruling and opposition parties agreed on earlier this year. However, the new plan is expected to also introduce structural changes by proposing a slower rate of increase for younger people to meet the 13% target, while the older generation would be subject to steeper increments. Other measures being mulled are automatically adjusting premium rates and income replacement levels based on economic and demographic conditions, as well as enhancing benefits for military personnel and new mothers.
The truth is, no other country has experienced a birth rate as low as South Korea's, so we need to take more drastic and unprecedented measures to ensure sustainability, intergenerational equity and old age income security. Otherwise, we'll see a divide between those who benefit and those who don't, and the system won't be sustainable.
Once the government proposal is submitted to the National Assembly, partisan discussions and social discourse are expected to follow as reform measures require changes to the National Pension Act. Woo Soo-young, Arirang News.
President Yoon is set to host New Zealand's Prime Minister Christopher Luxon next week. The top office announced on Monday that Luxon will be in South Korea for an official visit from Wednesday to Thursday. It also added that the two will meet and discuss ways to enhance practical bilateral ties as well as cooperation on the regional and international stage. South Korea and New Zealand are both part of NATO's Indo-Pacific 4 partners, along with Japan and Australia. The two leaders last met at the IP4 summit during the last NATO summit in Washington, D.C. A list of measures aimed at easing the burden of holiday-related expenses has been unveiled ahead of this year's Chuseok celebration. Min-hyuk with the details.
As part of efforts to support people's livelihoods ahead of the Korean Thanksgiving holiday, Chuseok, 3 weeks from now, South Korea will supply a record amount of Chuseok-related goods as well as other incentives. This plan was discussed during a meeting of senior officials from the government, the presidential office, and the ruling People Power Party on Sunday.
We need to focus more on the rising prices of vegetables, fruits, livestock, and seafood, as these are the areas where people feel the impact the most.
170,000 tons of the 20 most high-demand Chuseok items, including cabbage and apples, will be supplied to markets, the largest amount ever for Chuseok holiday. The government and the PPP also agreed to waive highway tolls and offer discounts of up to 40% for KTX and SRT train tickets for travelers from the provinces to the capital area during the Chuseok holiday. South Korea plans to provide 40 trillion Korean won, which is around $30 billion in financial support to small and medium-sized companies as well as small business owners to ease financial pressure, including lowering interest rates for loans. The government has also decided to purchase 50,000 tons of surplus rice from last year from farmers. Additional measures to stabilize falling rice prices will be announced before the middle of September. The PPP also made a request to the government to review designating this year's Armed Forces Day, which is October 1st, as a temporary holiday to honor active military personnel. The government will review factors including stirring up military morale, boosting consumer spending, and the impact on businesses before making a decision. 신하영, Arirang News.
North Korea's Kim Jong-un oversaw a test show of suicide drones this past weekend. The drones revealed by the regime appear similar to those used by Russia. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung has this report.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un supervised a performance test of so-called suicide drones on Saturday and called for the development of more to boost war readiness. According to state media on Monday, Kim oversaw the test of the new exploding drones, which are made to precisely destroy preset enemy targets on the ground and in the sea. Kim emphasized the need to develop different types of drones and improve combat capabilities for war operations. He also highlighted the importance of incorporating artificial intelligence technology when developing drones. Of the 2 drones revealed in the photographs, one resembles Russia's Lancet 3, which has had significant success in targeting Ukrainian forces. South Korea is looking into the possibility of Pyongyang receiving help from Moscow.
We are aware that Russia gave some drones to North Korea as gifts. We need to analyze various aspects, including whether North Korea made modifications to improve their performance.
One expert says the test could have been aimed at boasting that the regime is capable of producing and supplying drones to Russia.
Russia is currently very dependent on drones in the war against Ukraine. So if North Korea develops and now produces them, I believe it will be meaningful in the long term with regard to supplying weapons to Russia.
The expert also pointed out that the North's drones could be beneficial to the regime, as they are harder to detect and strike due to their small size and low-altitude flight maneuvers. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The National Intelligence Service says the new missile launchers Pyongyang recently claimed to have developed could reach as far as the central part of the country. However, it raises doubts about whether the regime can actually meet its own weapons demand. Our Lee Si-hoo has more.
Regarding North Korea's recent claim that it's equipped itself with 250 new tactical ballistic missile launchers, South Korea's intelligence agency believes that the missiles, if launched, could reach as far as Chungcheongdo province, having a possible range of 110 kilometers. But as to whether Pyongyang can actually supply itself with the missiles, South Korea has its doubts. This is according to a National Intelligence Service report made to the National Assembly Intelligence Committee on Monday. The vice chairman of the committee, lawmakers Lee Sung-kwon and Park Sun-won, following their meeting with the NIS, told reporters that there are concerns about the launcher's potential frontline placement in operation and that there is pressure to prepare for defense. But the NIS also believes that the regime's ongoing supply of weapons to Russia could make it difficult to meet its own demand for missiles. North Korean state media reported earlier this month that Pyongyang plans to deploy hundreds of new missile vehicles called transporter erector launchers to its border with South Korea. Lee Si-hu, Arirang News.
Turning to the Middle East, where tensions remain high, Hezbollah launched a major rocket and drone attack targeting Israel over the weekend to retaliate for the killing of its leader, against which Israel carried out preemptive strikes. Our Yoon looks into where all of this is headed.
Amid fears in the international community of escalation into a wider war, Israel and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah exchanged their most intense fire in months on Sunday. In the morning, air raid sirens rang throughout northern Israel as Hezbollah launched hundreds of rockets and drones in retaliation for Israel's killing of a top militant commander last month. Israel said it carried out a wave of preemptive strikes with 100 fighter jets to stop the attacks, and that they successfully took out at least 50% of the missiles that were planned to be launched into Israel and effectively repelled the subsequent attack. Hezbollah claims to have successfully launched over 300 missiles or drones at Israeli military sites.
So both sides are satisfied with the duel, so the escalation has stopped for the time being.
Sunday's attacks reportedly resulted in 3 deaths on Hezbollah's side and 1 on Israeli. Hezbollah asserted that this was only phase 1 of its attack on Israel, but confirmed no more attacks were currently planned. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that this was not the end of the story. The United States was not involved in the strikes directly, but helped track incoming Hezbollah weapons. Based on this, the professor provided a deeper insight into what to expect in the Israel-Hamas war.
After the exchange of airstrike from both sides, United States announced the 2 nuclear power aircraft carrier, Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, will be on its duty in the Middle East.
According to the professor, this means that the U.S. will be there to protect the security of Israel, but also clearly signals that enough is enough, which will make it hard for Netanyahu to continue his war with Hamas, as he proclaimed. The U.S. position also complicates Iran's potential retaliation for the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, as any misstep could escalate into a direct U.S.-Iranian conflict, which Tehran wants to avoid but Israel might prefer. Meanwhile, Gaza's health ministry has reported that 71 Palestinians were killed in Israeli operations just preceding the attacks. While high-level talks in Cairo on a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal ended without a final agreement, also on Sunday, lower-level talks are set to continue in the coming days. The death toll since the October 7th attacks has reached 40,405, with more than 93,000 Palestinians injured. Yoon, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, around 180 Koreans have allegedly entered Israel to attend a religious event, according to sources on Monday. This raises the number of those residing or present in the country to nearly 700. The South Korean government is said to have advised those residing in Israel, as well as those attending the religious event, to leave the country as soon as possible. There have been no reported casualties among any of the Korean nationals so far. The government added that it will continue to take necessary safety measures for Koreans abroad amid heightened tensions in the region. Elsewhere, an intense exchange of fire continues between Ukraine and Russia in both territories, as Kyiv's incursion into Russia's Kursk region looks to enter its 4th week. Lee Seung-jae covers this conflict.
On August 6th, Ukraine surprised the Kremlin with an incursion and attacks inside Russian territory. It's been nearly 3 weeks since the Ukrainian forces began operations in the Kursk region, and Kyiv says it's now using a new high-tech drones capable of precision strikes against its enemies. In response to the Ukrainian drone strikes in the southwestern border city of Belgorod, Russian authorities issued a state of emergency in the Voronezh region. Russian officials say 5 Russian civilians were killed and 12 others injured by the airstrikes. However, the Russian Defense Ministry says its military has things under control and claims it has repelled Ukrainian offensives. Russian defense officials say nearly 40 Ukrainian drones and 8 U.S.-made HIMARS missiles were shot down by its air defense system over a 24-hour period from Saturday into Sunday, adding that the Ukrainian military had suffered significant losses. Moscow's defense ministry claims that some 1,900 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the same 24-hour period inside Russian territory. It also added that it has sent more artillery and missiles to the region in order to repel Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, Russian forces inside Ukraine continue its offensives on the Eastern Front, with Ukrainians in the Donetsk being evacuated. Ukrainian officials said the Russian airstrikes on a hotel in the region killed a British national and injured 2 journalists, all reportedly working for Reuters. 이승재, Arirang News.
On the cultural front, an original musical based on Arirang, a traditional Korean folk song, has mesmerized people around the world. Chuseok delivers us the story.
The world is being captivated by the Korean musical Ari, the Spirit of Korea. It reinterprets the story of Arirang, a 600-year-old Korean folk song originating from Jong-un County in Gangwon province. It tells the story of a carpenter Shin Ki-mok who leaves his hometown and family to sail to the capital city Hanyang to rebuild Gyeongbokgung Palace. Ari Arari was created by Jong-un County Office as part of cultural events for the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Over the past 7 years, it has gained popularity, being showcased at various festivals worldwide.
We created cultural content using Jeonseon, Arirang to preserve Jeonseon County's unique identity, while adapting it to modern trends with universal themes like love, family, and home.
The musical was officially invited to one of the most prestigious arts and culture festivals in the United Kingdom, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, from August 1st to 25th, alongside 3,800 other productions. Director Yoon Jong-un said that he focused more on music than on language, aiming for everyone to experience the performance through all 5 senses with the Korean essence.
We performed a total of 23 times, and the local response was incredibly enthusiastic. Even though most of the audience were foreigners, they laughed and enjoyed it together. And as they left the venue, many of them were humming the melody of Arirang.
Last year, Ari Arari won the Best Physical Theatre Award at the Adelaide Fringe Festival in Australia. Even a foreign tourist who first saw Ari Arari there later visited Jongseon-gun and then went to this year's Edinburgh Festival specifically to see the performance again and meet the actors, which moved them to tears. Yoon also expressed hope that Ari Arari would make Koreans living abroad feel even prouder of their heritage.
In the early 1900s, some Koreans were forcibly relocated to Central Asia or left the Korean peninsula. We call this path the Arirang Road. Just like the Silk Road, Koreans have spread worldwide. Back then, it was a path of suffering. But now, through our performance, we dream of turning it into a path of joy.
He hopes that people worldwide will visit Jongseon at least once to experience Ari Arari. Chuseok, Arirang News.
Time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports editor, Paul Need. Evening, Paul.
Hello there.
Let's begin with football. The South Korean national team squad was announced this morning. What can you tell us?
Yes, well, it was the first squad announced by Hong Myung-bo since he was reappointed as manager. And there is a first call-up for Min-hyuk, the 18-year-old who's set to join Tottenham Hotspur from Gangwon FC in January. There's also a first call-up for his Gangwon teammate Hwang Moon-gi, as well as Incheon United's Cheo Jin and Lee Han-bom of FC Midtjylland in Denmark. The usual suspects are in too, of course, Son Heung-min, Lee Gang-in, Kim Min-jae and Hwang Hee-chan. South Korea take on Palestine at home on September 5th and then Oman away on the 10th to kick off the second round of qualification for the 2026 World Cup.
You mentioned Son Heung-min and Tottenham, a win for Spurs over the weekend.
Yes, their first win of the new Premier League season. Spurs beat Everton 4-0 at home on Saturday, and 2 goals for Son gets him off the mark. Son's first to make it 2-0 came after pickpocketing Pickford, the Everton goalkeeper, whose heavy touch allowed Son to nip in and put the ball into an empty net. Son's second was Tottenham's fourth, firing in from a tight angle after a burst forward by centre-back Mickey van der Ven, who then slid the ball into Son, who fired in at the near post. It's 4 points from 6 available for Spurs to start the new season, following the 1-1 draw with Leicester City on the opening weekend.
And moving on to golf, KLPGA legend Kim Min-hyuk has announced her retirement.
Yes, the announcement was made on Sunday, doing so after the AIG Women's Open in Scotland, a title that she won in 2017, her lone major. She joined the LPGA Tour in 2007, winning 7 titles in total. Meanwhile, Shin Ji-ae came ever so close to winning at St Andrews, finishing tied for second with 3 others, including Nelly Korda of the US. She shot a 2-under 74 in the final round to finish at 5 under par, just 2 strokes behind the winner Lydia Ko, the Seoul-born New Zealander. In the men's game, Im Sung-jae and An Byung-hun have both qualified for the PGA Tour playoff finale. They stayed inside the top 30 in the FedEx Cup points following the second playoff event on Sunday, the B&W Championship. Im and An, as well as Tom Kim, have also qualified for the President's Cup, a biennial match between the US and a team of non-European players.
And finally to baseball, Japanese baseball star Shohei Ohtani has made history.
Yes, on Friday local time, he joined the highly exclusive 40-40 club, that being 40 home runs and 40 stolen bases in a single season. Ohtani hit a 2-out walk-off grand slam in the 9th inning of the LA Dodgers' 7-3 win over the Tampa Bay Rays. His 40th steal came in the 4th inning of the same game. While he's only the 6th player to do this, he did it in the fastest time, just 126 games. The previous record of 147 was set by Alfonso Soriano in 2006.
All right, thanks for that, Paul. See you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Over the weekend, Seoul's record-breaking tropical nights took a short break, but with the lowest temperature in Seoul exceeding 25 degrees Celsius overnight, the night heat returned. Currently, a heat wave warning is issued in most parts of the country, and the hot weather will continue tomorrow. Tropical nights will appear tonight around the Seoul metropolitan area and coastal areas. Easterly winds will strengthen and it will rain on the East Coast and Jeju Island between tomorrow morning and Wednesday morning. There will also be gusty winds and thunderstorms in places with showers. Tomorrow, most areas will start off at least 23 degrees. Highs will rise up to 32 in Seoul, Daejeon and Busan, Daegu 33 degrees. By the weekend, cold air will come down from the north, temporarily easing the heat. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
Children's laughter, hope, dream. K-animation belongs in them. Interesting and valuable story that transcends between everyday life and dream. Surprising spectacle where imagination becomes real. An array of subjects catering from infants to adolescents. For our story to reach all corners of the world. K-animation makes healthy laughter for children. Completely new. But something anyone can relate with. Flawlessly made. And tears that go with it. K-drama. Korea is coming at you with another story to tell.
Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Han-darin Seol. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris delivered a historic nomination acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention last week, officially opening up 70 days of heated race for the White House. Attention is now focused on who will take the lead, with the momentum from the DNC and endorsement of Republican nominee Donald Trump by independent candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. Meanwhile, here in Korea, reports are pouring in about the potential impacts of a Harris or Trump presidency on the country's security and the economy. On today's Within the Frame, we look into the latest key developments in the U.S. presidential race and explore their potential implications for South Korea. For that, Dr. Peter K. Lee, research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, is here with us via Skype. He's also a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Studies Center at University of Sydney. It's so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. Always a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be with you.
All right, Jessica, let's start off with you. First, let's do a replay of the Democratic National Convention. Give us your overall assessment of the big event and the highlights, of course, of Harris's acceptance speech.
Well, the DNC convention was really about introducing Kamala Harris to Americans who don't know her outside of the vice presidency, of establishing her biography, of her personality, of what has led her to this moment. And so some of the highlights included the remarks of her husband and the repeated phrase, "a joyful warrior." In terms of her convention speech, she also used that to introduce herself to Americans who may not know her well. She talked about her upbringing and her childhood in California, the daughter of an Indian American mother and a Jamaican-born father, and the observations she had about race and class and the things that are important to her as a politician. She talked about she talked about her work as a prosecutor, as Attorney General of the state of California, and now as Vice President. And she made an appeal to Republicans who denied that Trump lost the 2020 election to Biden, really trying to get additional votes to cross the aisle to her. That includes independents and Republicans who are disenfranchised with the way Trump reacted to his election loss. And she told them that she'd be a president for all of them, which is something we also heard from Barack Obama years ago, a real effort to reach across the aisle. She also waded a little bit into foreign policy. We haven't seen her talk a lot about her own views on foreign policy. She did say that she's going to, as president, if elected, defend U.S. alliances as well as abortion access. But other than that, political analysts really say that she didn't have a lot of policy in her speech. And for that matter, they also say Trump hasn't had a lot of policy in his speeches. He, for his part, meaning Donald Trump, criticizing Kamala's speech for complaining too much about the national conditions despite being in office herself for the last 3.5 years. But all in all, we see a real bump in terms of fundraising for the Harris-Walz campaign. $500 million raised just before her speech, and at last count, $540 million raised towards her campaign, and her campaign chair saying much of it is coming from new donors and from younger donors, both of whom are constituencies that this campaign is looking for.
So the DNC led to a massive fundraising for the Democratic Party. You said $540 million. That's a lot. And Harris saw a polling boost, according to many reports, and we'll talk about that later on. But before that, Dr. Lee, the next major event is undoubtedly the first presidential TV debate between Harris and Trump, set for September 10th. What would be some central issues of debate, and what key aspects should South Korea pay attention to?
Sure, Dan. I mean, I think just picking up on what Jessica was mentioning there, I mean, if the DNC National Convention was a chance for Vice President Harris to introduce herself to the American public and to the world, I think this next first debate with former President Trump is going to be a way to test her values, her principles, her policy agenda. So as Jessica was mentioning, we don't really know a great deal about what Harris thinks personally about the legacy with President Biden over the last 3.5 years. And so I think really it's going to be a challenge to find out, how much of what has been achieved is part of her legacy that she wants to continue and what she wants to forge on her own. So I think from a Korean perspective, at least, it's going to be how both candidates in this debate talk about the role of alliances, but also the great challenges that they face, right? So this idea of the axis of authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, but also North Korea and Iran. And so really what role the United States sees allies playing in terms of that great contest. And I think from a Korean perspective, more specifically, it's going to be the role of extended nuclear deterrence and really the role that the Biden administration has played in empowering U.S. allies to take greater steps for their own security. So we these things like AUKUS, the Washington Declaration with South Korea, really these are pretty unprecedented steps that the Biden administration took. So we're curious to see how both candidates want to go forward in that area.
The TV debate will certainly be another historic pivot point in the U.S. presidential race, and it'll be quite interesting to watch how Trump will take on Harris, who's now enjoying surging momentum. Now, Jessica, independent presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. has suspended his campaign, throwing his support behind Trump. Is the endorsement emerging as a key factor likely to significantly impact the race?
Well, I think the key to your question there is significantly, right? And we just don't have all of the data yet in terms of the polling on what this could mean to the Trump campaign. But as you mentioned, over the weekend, we saw Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Basically leaving his own campaign under the impression that his own polling was telling him that he was going to be taking votes from Trump and giving them to Harris if he stayed in the race. So he got out, he endorsed Trump, and initially polls were showing that he would pull votes away from Biden, and then later on, as I said, going really that his candidacy was going to hurt Trump more than Democrats. So he pulled out, looked for that endorsement, possibly looking for a position in a Trump administration. Political observers, in terms of the impact, though, really looking at the impact not just on the national race of him pulling out, but on critical swing states in particular. A Cook Political Report survey showing that voters that found that, of those voters in swing states, finding that Kennedy was losing ground with some of them. So it's not really clear yet where they're going to land. And there are some political observers who say that his voters might not vote at all. They might be really not looking for the sort of choice between these two candidates of Trump and Harris, or Trump and Biden part two. Others, though, looking to see for some kind of short-term bump for Trump. Again, the polling data not all in, and so we are looking for what that could mean for the Trump campaign. He certainly does have some common policy positions with Kennedy, especially when it comes to pulling out of global wars and rebuilding the middle class.
Because it's such a tight race, his endorsement could matter for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, especially in swing states, as you pointed out. But we don't know for sure how much of an impact it'll have. Now, Jessica, you mentioned that we need more polls, more poll results, more data to get a clearer picture. But give us an analysis of the latest polls and what other variables other than the TV debate are expected to shape the election landscape going forward.
So you mentioned it's a very close race, and that's very evident in the polls. We are seeing by Nate Silver, who's one of the leading influential political observers in the United States, a gap of about 4 points. Harris pulling ahead of Trump in a national average of polls at 4 points. Washington Post just saying a few hours ago that the spread is 2 points. So these are well within margins of error, and there's no question that both campaigns are looking at this as a very tight race. And that, of course, means that it's going to come down to where it comes down to, and we talk about this often, those swing states, those 8 or 9 states where the electorate is not in the tank for one party or another. A lot of them are in the Midwest. Some of them are in the Southeast, including Georgia. And that's where we're going to find both of these campaigns campaigning heavily, hitting these states hard. We're going to see Trump and Vance in Michigan this week. We're going to see Harris and Walz in Georgia. And again, these are the states where the voters and the way that they decide to vote in November are really going to determine the outcome. We know that so far Harris in particular is polling better than Trump in the 18 to 34 demographic, Black and Hispanic voters, Trump leading with white and older voters. So it's also going to really come down to a turnout game. Can the get out to vote effort for both of these campaigns, can they get their voters to the polls? It's typically easier to get older voters to the polls than it is younger voters. And so that's going to be a factor in what the outcome is. Who is voting and who are they voting for? But that outcome, that turnout the vote, really key, especially for Harris.
So voter turnout is, of course, another very crucial point in elections. Now, let's look into the foreign policy directions of Harris and Trump. Dr. Lee, you mentioned that we are yet to find out a lot more about Harris's foreign policy directions, but can you give us a rough outline of the two candidates' respective foreign policy approaches with a focus on their North Korea policy?
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to North Korea, I mean, U.S. foreign policy has really been at an impasse for the last 6 or 7 years, since about 2018, when President Trump last met Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. And so the U.S., on both sides has been in a holding pattern in terms of what to do with North Korea and the efforts at denuclearization. So I think in that sense, it's really a new opportunity come this November election to reset and to try new approaches. So we've seen that Vice President Harris has talked about how she will stand up to what she calls dictators, such as Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, you had former President Trump mentioning that he got along well with Kim Jong-un and that he can handle these kinds of big issues and deal with strong men like North Korea. So I think you see the difference of approaches that they might take, but I think really it's important to keep in mind that North Korea is not the priority issue for either candidate at the moment in terms of foreign policy. So it's going to be dealing with the war in Ukraine, it's going to be dealing with the war in Gaza, it's going to be dealing with China. And it's really the question of where North Korea fits into those larger puzzles. And I think, this idea of an axis of evil, an axis of authoritarian regimes that is increasingly talked about in America, North Korea's support for Russia, those will be the key variables that determine how the United States approaches the North Korean question. And it's really, I think, situation contingent. So much has changed in the last year or two in terms of North Korea's perceived threat to the United States. But I think, there's much more to be seeing in the coming weeks and months.
Right. It's undeniable that Washington has been placing North Korea in the back burner for quite some time now. And what will matter a lot more, the bigger question would be how they would deal with other countries like Russia and China in the region. Now, Dr. Lee, South Korea is also paying keen attention to the effects of America's so-called Polyconomy, how Harris and Trump's presidency would impact Korean companies and the overall economy. What are your biggest hopes and concerns?
So, I mean, the concern is that this is one area where there is great bipartisan consensus in America, it seems. This idea of an economic statecraft, the revival of American manufacturing, and America first in very different shades, whether it's, build back better, whether it's America first, jobs for American workers. So I think it's an area that, has become an easy target for, economically advanced allies such as South Korea, but also Japan, Russia, some of the Northern European countries. And so it's something where, there's been, growing bipartisan efforts, not only within the executive branch in the United States, but also within Congress. So both the House and the Senate have pushed, efforts to strengthen Buy American quotas and other areas of industrial policy. And that's really making a comeback right now. And I think that has effects not only economically, but also into the defense space as well, in terms of how the US is going to work with some of its, really important allies like Korea and Japan. I think for the hope for Korea is that, as Jessica was mentioning, some of those really key swing states, Korean firms have made, record investments into some of these areas, particularly in the Southeast, such as Georgia. And so, President Biden used to talk all about how he had attracted $100 billion of Korean corporate investment in the 3 years that he had been president. So in that sense, I think, the Korean companies have tried to demonstrate that they can deliver a win-win outcome with US workers, with US voters. And so I think there's an opportunity there to build on that success without it becoming a zero-sum equation, I think, from whoever wins the election.
Now to the Middle East, Jessica. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has concluded his trip to the region without much progress in Gaza ceasefire talks. What do we know so far about Washington's plans for Gaza's future? And how does Harris's stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict compare to Trump's?
Well, I think we see increasingly that there's a constituency in the Democratic Party, and particularly in younger voters, that is very much shaped by this conflict. For example, at the convention, we saw about 270 delegates sign a petition asking the Democratic Party to take a different position on this conflict and make aid to Israel contingent on certain agreements regarding human rights. In her own convention speech, she did basically take the same position as Joe Biden has in terms of supporting Israel's right to defense. And what's more, the party continued their position, ignoring that petition that I mentioned before, and instead continuing the position that Israel has a right to self-defense, that a ceasefire in exchange for the hostages is a priority, and that they also back a two-state solution. The DNC did not add any language conditioning military support to Israel in any way. In terms of Donald Trump's approach, we largely have a promise that he's going to end wars in the Ukraine and Gaza without a lot of detail. And some of that is, sort of the idea that he says, well, these things wouldn't happen on my watch. Again, that's a claim that doesn't have a lot of explanation from his vantage point. Remember that he, on July 26th, did meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the United States, asking him, quote, to get the war over with. He says he will give Israel the support it needs to win the war in Gaza. He claims that Vice President Harris, by demanding a ceasefire, is tying Israel's hands. And he also says he will arrest and deport these pro-Palestinian supporters if he becomes president. So somewhat of a different approach between these two, but largely still taking the traditional U.S. position that the U.S. is a key ally of Israel's, while we see Harris certainly giving more attention to the plight of the Gazans, of those who have been displaced and killed, and who are now affected by the food shortages and the violence that's going on there, but yet still maintaining the position that the U.S. has had for quite some time with respect to Israel.
Dr. Lee, a group of top U.S. politicians from both ends of the political aisle are expected to visit Seoul early next month. What would be the purpose of their visit, and what sort of outcome do you anticipate?
So there have been reports that a Senate delegation will visit Korea as part of sort of trilateral talks with the US, Japan, and Korea in terms of economic security cooperation, going back to our discussion earlier. But I really think the purpose is sort of twofold. It's to shore up the two bilateral alliances in Northeast Asia that the US has, so with South Korea, but also with Japan, but also to keep that momentum going in terms of the US preference for trilateral and minilateral cooperation. So the Biden administration, but also the first Trump administration, has gone very hard in terms of minilateral cooperation. So we think about the Quad, AUKUS, and now Camp David partnership. These are areas where the US is very keen for its allies to work more closely together with each other as well as with the United States. So I think this delegation is really visiting Northeast Asia to show that the US will stay committed regardless of who becomes the president. And it's also because it's a Senate delegation with senators who are not up for re-election in this coming election. It's to show that there will be continuity, I think, in the US commitment, regardless of who wins the White House, but also the Congress on November 5.
And we'll conclude our discussions on that note. Well, the U.S. election holds significant implications for South Korea, affecting security, the economy, and much more. So we'll be watching closely as developments unfold. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for your presence with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jessica, as always, for your perspectives.
Great to see you.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.